Me and my husband bought our dream home. My mother-in-law demanded that it is a family home and my sister-in-law should move in. Well, I still remember the day we signed the papers for our dream home. It was a beautiful two-story house with large bay windows, a spacious front yard, and a porch swing that I had always dreamed of. The place was perfect, a manifestation of years of sacrifice, hard work, and perseverance. Standing in the living room with my husband, David, as we admired the sunlight pouring through the tall windows, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This house wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything we had overcome. We had spent more than a decade saving for it. Both of us had worked long hours, often sacrificing weekends and holidays. I took on extra shifts at the hospital, while David, a construction engineer, worked overtime on sites far from home. We had no family support, none at all. My parents had passed away years ago, and David's family was never there for us. His mother, Margaret, had always been blatantly biased toward her daughter, Claire. While David was treated as an afterthought, Claire was showered with love, attention, and financial support. I still vividly recall the day David lost his job a few years ago when his company downsized. We were struggling to keep up with rent and bills. David swallowed his pride and asked Margaret for a loan, just enough to hold us over for a few months until he could get back on his feet. Margaret's response was cruel and dismissive. She shook her head and scowled. "You're a grown man, David. You need to learn how to handle your finances. I can't just keep bailing you out." I wanted to scream. Margaret had never lifted a finger to help us, yet she had no problem buying Claire a brand new SUV just months before, despite the fact that Claire was perfectly capable of affording her own car. When Claire got divorced, Margaret dipped into her retirement savings to help her daughter buy a condo. But when David and I were struggling to scrape together a down payment for a modest home, Margaret wouldn't even give us a dime. We learned to stop asking. We realized we were on our own. But despite the unfairness, David and I pushed through. We tightened our belts, cut back on vacations, and lived frugally. And finally, after years of determination, we bought our home. It was ours, fully and completely. Little did we know that Margaret would soon try to stake her claim on it. We had only been living in the house for 7 months when Margaret paid us a visit. She arrived unannounced, as she often did, and immediately started criticizing and undermining everything. She walked around with a pinched expression, making snide comments about the furniture, the wall colors, and the decor. "Oh, you chose this color for the kitchen? It's a little dull, don't you think?" she remarked. The guest room is so small. Are you sure you don't feel cramped in here?" I forced a smile, biting my tongue, while David's jaw tightened, and then came the bombshell. "You know, Claire is having a really hard time," Margaret said, placing her hand over mine with a dramatic sigh. "That condo she bought is too expensive for her now. She can't keep up with the payments." I stiffened. I knew exactly where this was going. Margaret put on her most pitiful expression, the one she always used when she wanted to emotionally manipulate us. She looked at us with wide, pleading eyes and said softly, "You have such a big house, Patricia. You don't even need all this space. It's practically a family home. Wouldn't it make sense for Claire to move in? Just until she gets back on her feet." Her words hit me like a slap. A family home? When had Margaret ever treated us like family? We had fought tooth and nail to afford this house without any help from her, while she had bent over backward for Claire at every opportunity. And now, she wanted us to hand over our hard-earned home to her daughter. I couldn't even form a response. I just stared at her, dumbfounded. David, however, wasn't having it. He set down his mug with a deliberate clink, leaned forward, and locked eyes with his mother. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. His voice was calm but ice-cold. "This is our home. Claire isn't moving in." Margaret blinked in disbelief. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She wasn't used to David standing up to her. He had always been the obedient son, the one who bit his tongue. But not anymore. Still, Margaret wasn't going to give up easily. But David, it's not fair, she whined. You have more space than you need. And Claire, she's your sister. You can't just let her suffer. David's jaw tightened. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. Claire is not my responsibility, he said through gritted teeth. She has already taken enough from us. In the weeks that followed Margaret's outrageous demand, her favoritism became even more blatant. She wasn't just subtly biased anymore, she was downright cruel, making it clear that in her eyes, Claire was the only child who mattered. It started with the little things, petty acts meant to remind us that we weren't as valued. She began excluding us from family plans. Claire's needs and struggles were suddenly everyone's priority, while David and I were treated like outsiders. One weekend, Margaret organized a family dinner at her house. We were never formally invited, we found out through a cousin's social media post. When David confronted his mother, her response was chillingly casual. "Oh," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "I didn't think you'd be interested." It was just something small for Claire. She needed cheering up. Claire always needed cheering up, apparently. Never mind the fact that David and I were still recovering financially from years of saving for the house. Never mind that we had no support from anyone during our struggles. But it didn't stop there. One day, David's truck broke down on his way home from a site. His work vehicle was essential, it transported his equipment and tools. The repairs were expensive, and we were still catching up from the costs of buying the house. With reluctance, David reached out to his mother, hoping she would lend him some money, just a temporary loan. He didn't even ask for much. Just enough to get the truck fixed so he could keep working. Margaret's voice was clipped and unsympathetic. "Oh, David. I can't help you with that." She clucked her tongue in fake sympathy. "You have a house now. You should be able to manage your finances better. I can't just keep bailing you out." Her words were laced with condescension. She spoke to him as if he were a failure. As if he were a beggar. But a mere week later, Margaret proudly announced at a family gathering that she had helped Claire upgrade her car. Her precious daughter apparently deserved something reliable after everything she had been through. The blatant hypocrisy made my blood boil. But the most infuriating moment came when David was hospitalized after a minor construction accident. He had suffered a concussion when scaffolding collapsed unexpectedly, and I rushed him to the hospital. He had to stay overnight for observation. I called Margaret immediately, assuming she would at least show some concern for her son's well-being. She answered on the second ring. "Oh, hi, Patricia. I'm a bit busy right now," she said breezily. I could hear Claire's voice in the background, laughing at something on TV. "Margaret, David's in the hospital," I said firmly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. There was a brief pause before she responded with thinly veiled indifference. "Oh dear. Well. Keep me updated, all right? I'm with Claire right now, she had a stressful day, and I'm helping her unwind." I stared at the phone in disbelief. Her son was in the hospital, and she couldn't even be bothered to visit. Instead, she was coddling Claire, as always. I didn't tell David right away, I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes. When he finally found out, he didn't say much. He simply nodded, his face completely blank. But I saw the pain flash across his eyes, the familiar pain of being discarded and forgotten. A few weeks later, Margaret showed up at our doorstep with Claire in tow. Their arms were full of suitcases and boxes, and they wore smug, expectant expressions, as though we were simply going to roll over and welcome them in. I opened the door, my face frozen with barely restrained fury. David appeared behind me. His face a mask of disbelief and anger. Margaret's voice was falsely cheerful. "Oh. Didn't you get my message?" she asked sweetly, pretending to be surprised by our shocked expressions. She placed a hand on Claire's shoulder in a performative display of maternal concern. "Claire just needs a place to stay for a few weeks. I knew you'd agree. Her tone was so casual and condescending, as if she were doing us a favor by allowing Claire to occupy our home. Claire, for her part, barely even looked at us. She stood there with a smirk, entirely confident that she would be welcomed in with open arms. She was so accustomed to Margaret paving the way for her that she assumed we would simply cave. I stared at them, my heart pounding with fury. How dare they? After everything we had sacrificed for this home, they were standing on our doorstep with their suitcases and their entitlement, expecting us to hand over our sanctuary without a fight. David's voice was low and dangerous. "You don't get to make this decision for us," he said coldly. His eyes narrowed. "This is our home. Not yours. Not Claire's. Ours." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, her expression morphing into mock hurt. She placed a hand on her chest in dramatic disbelief, as though David had just slapped her. "David," she gasped. "How can you be so cruel? She's your sister. You can't just let her live on the streets." I scoffed, crossing my arms. "Claire is perfectly capable of supporting herself," I snapped. "You've handed her enough money over the years to buy half the city." Claire's smug smile faltered slightly, but Margaret wasn't done. Her eyes hardened, and she leveled me with a cold glare. "You ungrateful brat," she hissed at me. "After everything I've done for you too," I cut her off with a harsh, bitter laugh. "What, exactly, have you done for us?" I snapped, my voice shaking with fury. "You let us struggle for years without lifting a finger. You gave Claire everything. And now you expect us to let her waltz into our home like she owns it?" David stepped forward. His voice was calm but lethal. "Get off our property. Now." Margaret's face turned red with rage. She opened her mouth, ready to spit more venom, but David's unwavering stare silenced her. Claire let out an indignant scoff, flipping her hair with a look of utter disbelief. "You'll regret this," she sneered, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Don't expect us to be there when you need us." I let out a cold, humorless laugh. "We've never needed you." Margaret glared at us both, her face contorted with fury, but she knew she was defeated. Without another word, she grabbed Claire by the arm and stormed back to the car. Their tires screeched as they sped away. David and I stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle. Neither of us spoke. The house was finally silent, free from the weight of their entitlement. In the following weeks, Margaret made good on her threats. She spread lies about us to the extended family, claiming we had abandoned them in their time of need. She painted us as selfish and ungrateful, telling anyone who would listen that we had turned our backs on Claire, but we didn't care. The people who mattered knew the truth. We owed Margaret and Claire nothing. David and I threw ourselves into making the house a true reflection of us. We repainted the guest room, the very one Margaret had criticized, in warm, inviting colors. We added personal touches to every corner. The garden in the front yard bloomed with color. One evening, as we sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset, David took my hand and smiled. "No matter what they say, this is ours, Patricia," he whispered. I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his arms around me. The weight that had once burdened us, the years of being treated as less than, the unfairness, the discrimination, was gone. We were finally free. And no amount of manipulation, guilt, or entitlement would ever take that away from us.